I have a very basic scene here using a couple of boxes and a few poles, and I want to put some lights in, some very simple lights, just standard lights, and I want to cast some shadows in the scene using again some simple shadow map shadows. So how do we go about this? Um, what I want to do here is I have my scene and I want to go up into create panel and go along to lights. Okay, now by default nowadays Max is set up to use photometric lights. We don't want to use photometric lights in this instance, okay? We want to use the older, kind of cheaper, I mean more inexpensive in terms of rendering, um, standard lights. And we go onto those by clicking on the right arrow here, the black arrow here, to get our other option. And we move it from photometric to standard, okay? So I click on standard lights and you can see I've got this array of lights that I have as possibilities. Now I want to set up a basic 2 light setup. It's very much like you'd see in a standard studio, a film studio. We want to have a key light and we want to have a fill light. The key light is our main shadow casting light, it's like the sun, and then we have a fill light which kind of makes the shadows less black, okay? So what we do is we can use a target spot or a target direct here. We can use a free spot or a free direct, but I'm going to use target spot here in this instance because the target spot is more steerable. We can control the direction of it far more readily because it has this target object. Okay, I'm going to click on target spot, and then in the top view here I'm going to left click down on my mouse. That's where the target light is created, and then I hold the left button down until I'm happy as to where the target is. This is where the light will be looking, and then I let the left button off, and the light is created. Now we get this kind of eerie, spooky effect here, but what we need to do here is lift the light up off the ground. So we grab it using just the standard select and move here, and we move the light up off the ground plane, and you can see we end up with this effect here. So again, it's lighting our scene here. If I click on the perspective pane and click on render, you can see it's got shadows. We've got an edge to the light that's rather harsh. There's no shadows being cast here, but you can see where the light is and where the light isn't. Okay, so this is very harsh, not a very effective or attractive lighting setup. So first thing we need to do is start putting in some shadows, etc., etc. Then we need to soften the shadows in another way. Okay, so what we do to set up the shadows is we grab our light, just the light here, okay, and we grab that spot 01 there like that, and we go up here into the modify bar here. It's just along from create here, this blue rainbow here, and we click on modify. And when we have the light selected and we click on modify, we'll end up with the parameters, the standard or general parameters for the lights, okay, or for this light in particular. Now the first thing we do way up the top here is we want to create shadows, so we click shadows on, okay, and you can see in the proxy view here that when we click that on, lo and behold, shadows are created. Indeed, just to have a look at this here, we can see now the shadows are being created. Still very harsh looking, etc., etc., but the shadows are in there indubitably. Now, what we do here is we need to soften this cone here of the light. You can see if we render this again, it's got a very hard edge to the light here, and that's very unattractive. Okay, so that's something that we could perhaps soften. So what we do is we go down along the parameters here, down to this spotlight parameters. If it's closed here, it'll look like that, and there'll be a plus sign, and what we do here is just open that up by clicking on it, and it should open up like that, very slow. And you can see the difference between the hotspot beam, that's the center of the light, and the fall off field is very little. The two cones, the hotspot beam is indicated by this light blue cone here, and there's a fall off indicated by this dark blue cone. Now, what we need to do to soften the light is either reduce the hotspot or increase the fall off. What we're doing is we're increasing the difference between the hotspot and the fall off. And if we do this, it'll soften the edge effect of the light. So I'm going to increase the fall off and reduce the hotspot a little bit, and then click on the render, and sure enough we can see that that edge to the light is softened. That's okay. Now our shadows are still terribly harsh black shadows. Also we've got this kind of effect here that there's an aliasing, a kind of jagginess to the light, to the shadows here. And a third effect we don't want here is that it seems that the poles are up off the ground, whereas if we look in this viewport here, we can see that no, the geometry of the poles is buried right into the ground. So there are three very bad effects there. A harsh blackness to the thing, and then this jaggy, and then the poles being seemingly up in the air. So there are a couple of problems with our shadows here. First thing we've got to do is address this jaggy shadow thing. And we do that by going into the light, the shadow casting light again. Now what we need to do is go way down the bottom to the shadow map parameters. Again, when we go down the bottom here, it may well be that the shadow map parameters in the light parameters are closed, and we will click on it to open them up. Okay, and we've got three settings here: bias, size, and sample range. So these are the shadow map bias, the shadow map size, and the sample range. The first thing we're going to do is change the size here, and the shadow map size is what's causing this jaggy effect on the shadow map shadow itself. Okay, this is tagged to RAM, and it's set at 512 because when this part of Max was written, a huge CGI workstation at that time, a few years ago, would have been blessed to have 512 megabytes of RAM. So nowadays we're dealing with workstations that have 2 gigs or 4 gigs as standard in terms of RAM, so we've no shortage of RAM. Okay, so we can afford to increase this shadow map size up to 2000. Let's go mad and increase it up to 2000. You can put it up to 4000, but I'd suggest you try it and test it. Now we test it by trying a render. So again, we click on render production, and we can see, sure enough, our shadows are gone far more edgy there, like that. You know, we're still getting a little bit of aliasing here that's quite unattractive, but our shadows have gone very sharp, a little bit too sharp in some ways. Okay, but still, that's sorted that out. The other problem we have is that we still end up with the poles seeming to float above the ground plane, whereas the geometry of the poles is firmly buried into the ground plane. So what we have to do again here is go down into the shadow map parameters here, and this suspension or apparent suspension is caused by the shadow map bias. It's defaulted at 1, and what we've got to do is reduce that. Now we could reduce it all the way down to 0.0, but I think superstition kind of means that we usually reduce this down to 0.01, so we leave a little tiny bit of bias in there. Okay, and then when we click on this here, we're looking for the poles to seem to be tied to the ground plane. We click on render, and sure enough, the poles, these fine objects, are clicked into the ground plane as they are in terms of geometry here. So that's it. So now the shadow map and the renderer are handling the shadow casting poles. That's cool. The last thing is we're still getting this jaggy effect on the shadow, and it's quite an unattractive thing. Now the simplest way to solve this is, again, grab the shadow casting light, and what we do here is we raise the sample range of the shadow maps. Okay, and what I'm going to do is raise it from default 4 up to 12. And if we click on render here, again, we're looking for this effect to change here. We click on render, and you see, sure enough, we end up with a much softer shadow. Now we can go nuts here and jack that up to 24, and then again render again, and we end up with a much softer thing. Now sometimes it can start getting a little bit too soft. Okay, I'd suggest that this is starting to lose a little bit of definition here. Either we'd have to increase the shadow map size here, but I'd suggest that what we do here is we'd reduce this back down to maybe 18. You're trying to get a blend between the shadow map size, the map bias, etc., etc., and that's quite a good one there. I might even reduce it further in a moment. The last problem we've got here is that we still are in this black and white situation. We've got black shadows here, and we've got a white, and this is very unrealistic. I know it's very dramatic, all right, but it's very unrealistic. What we need to do is soften the black areas, and we do this by using another light. In a standard studio setup, this spot, the shadow casting light, is called a key light, and what we would do in the studio is have a fill light, and it's normally a smaller light. It might have a lot of diffuser on it, and it might have a gel to color it some a blue or whatever. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create another light, and we usually put it over on the other side of the scene here, and this is a standard studio setup. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go create here, and again I need a standard light. Okay, lights standard, not photometric. Okay, so we go again standard lights, and I could create another target spot here, but what I'm going to do is create an omni on this side. An omni is an omnidirectional light. Again, in top view, I'm going to click on an omnidirectional light here. I'm going to lift it up using select and move up out of the ground plane, and you can see it's starting to fill these shadows. Now, if I render here, we have achieved another effect here where the shadows are being bleached out, and this is also quite unattractive. How would I do this? Well, I can move the light further and further away, etc., etc., from my scene, but really what I want to do here is I want to turn this light down a bit. Okay. Now, what the problem is here is that the multiplier, the power of this light, is identical. It's set at a default 1, and it's identical to the power, the multiplier of my spotlight. So I'm going to need to turn this light down a bit. Okay, so I grab on my omni light here, I go into modify again, I've got the general parameters for my light, and you can see sure enough intensity, color and attenuation are all set at standard. The color is white and the multiplier is 1. What I need to do here is turn that down to, we'll say 0.5. If I render that here, you can see the effect of the light is toned down. I could even afford to take it down even further, so I'll take it down to say 0.4. Instead of using the spinner here, I'm just going to type this in, okay, and then click again, and you can see 0.4, a much more attractive setup. I'm getting a bit of fill in my lights, but I'm still getting some shadows here. That's fantastic, Now, the last thing is this is still very monochromatic, and it is kind of unrealistic. So what I'm going to do is put in a little bit of color in this. If this were the sun, if this were an exterior setup in the northern hemisphere of our planet, it would be quite usual for this white light here, this key light, the sun, to have maybe a little bit of color and maybe a little bit of yellow in it, So what I might do here is put in a little tiny bit of yellow like that, just something faint like that there, okay? Don't go mad on it. Okay, that's a little bit green. So there we go. That's something like that. Okay, if I render that, then you can see it's got a little bit of, as photographers would call it, a little bit of flavor. Okay, my omni light, my fill light, is still very white, and in a studio it would be quite usual for us to put a color gel on this. Again, we've reduced the multiplier of it down to 4, or 0.4 rather, but it's still a white light. Okay, and for a northern hemisphere setting, it's quite usual for this fill light to be a blue. Okay, so we can change it to a blue and go okay like that, and you can see it's a soft chalky kind of blue, and if we render that there, we end up with this set. Again, it's a subtle effect, but it really does add a lot of kind of production value to your scene. Again, this is a 2-light setup using very standard shadows, etc., etc. It's very inexpensive to render, but it really looks well. Now, the last little trick you could do, you could go nuts on this color here. Pixar used to use a setup where they used to use an ultramarine, we'll say, for the fill light. And you can see here, if you do this, you end up with this sort of setup, a quite early Pixar characteristic kind of setup. It's really unrealistic, but it's a highly stylized look, and it can be something that you can use for nighttime setups, etc., etc., with moonlight, etc. It can be quite dramatic. Okay, but let's change it back to our more northern hemisphere default. We do that by grabbing on this here. We'll bring it down to this chalky thing here, and I'll just dull it off a little tiny bit here. So we end up with this sort of thing here. I'm going to click on the render here again. Again, this is how to set up a standard pair of lights, a key light and an omni light, a fill light, using standard lights and shadow map shadows, and we get a very kind of pleasing effect on our very simple scene, and we solve some problems with the standard shadows as well. Okay, so that's the end of this one.